Hello again. For this lecture, I'd like to give you a little introduction to populism, which is a big part of the extra credit assignment for this week, if anyone is excited and interested in filling that out for the course. But populism has at least two definitions. The first is a specific social movement representing at first the interests of rural agrarians and later farmers and workers between the 1870s and the early 20th century. The social movement was largely responsible for many of the democratic reforms which regulated capitalism during the period. Secondly, populism is also described as a political style. You maybe have heard this a lot in the most recent presidential election. But this is a definition that tends to transcend time and space in a large part because it is so politically volatile. Well-known populist figures have included Andrew Jackson, William Jennings Bryan, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Huey Long, George Wallace, Louis Day Hicks, and Sarah Palin. Populism as an ideology can be both deeply conservative and deeply democratic. Lastly, both forms of populism were most successful in affecting the national arena. That is, it was trans-regional. The political definition has appealed to politicians of all stripes, while the populist movement successfully drove national economic reforms with an influence stretching into the New Deal. We'll start by talking about the Grange. In most rural communities, some forms of populism took shape. The U.S. was still an agrarian society by the turn of the 20th century, and in 1890, 64% of the total population lived in rural areas, many of which suffered economic hardship and were primed for protest. And what do I mean about agrarian poverty? It means that a bushel of wheat that sold for $1.45 in 1866 brought only 80 cents in 49 cents by the mid-1890s. So the price of these foods and these goods was going down. Transportation and storage costs were high and not dropping, and many farmers in the South were either sharecroppers or tenant farmers, meaning they didn't actually own the land that they farmed on. The Western farmer also suffered, especially in Colorado, where absentee capitalists seized control of access to transportation and water, and different monopolistic behavior, it's a tongue twister, by railroads echoed among farmers, miners, and ranchers. In California, Washington, and Oregon, for example, wheat and fruit growers found opportunities blocked by railroads' control of transportation and storage rate. So in the 1870s, there's a farm organization known as the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange, and this arose and instituted a cooperative program to help farmers to help themselves. The buying and selling co-ops founded by the Grange attempted to put more money into farmers' pockets by getting rid of the middleman from these economic transactions. So despite these heroic efforts by members of the Grange, the cooperative movement failed for a variety of reasons. The middlemen, the target of the movement, fought back by refusing to let farmers sharecrop the land they owned, and they denied farmers credit at mercantile stores they ran or refused to buy or process the farmers' crops at any price whatsoever. The cooperative stores set up by the Grange also failed because they were underfinanced and could not afford to offer goods for sale on a credit basis. This was forcing poor farmers into the hands of credit merchants who charged higher prices but made credit available under the crop lien system. So farmers were desperate to convert their remaining crop into cash to meet debts and live between growing seasons, and they were forced to sell to local buyers at whatever price they could get. Essentially, the Grange was not effective with this. Because of the failure of the Grange to solve agrarian problems through its self-help programs, farmers became more militant. The Farmers' Alliance was a much more politically motivated organization, and it began to attract more and more support in the 1880s as it demanded a governmental response to the plight of the farmers. So again, keep in mind these ideas of social movements and how we move from Grange-like kind of movement to the Farmers' Alliance and trying to achieve change on a governmental level. In 1889, Charles McCune organized the National Farmers' Alliance and Industrial Union. This organization had 3 million members by 1890 and only permitted whites to join. At the same time, the National Colored Farmers Alliance and Cooperative Union formed an African-American version of this group. Both of these organizations began in the South, but they quickly moved to the North and the West. So this alliance called upon the federal government to institute a sub-treasury program to help farmers avoid being forced to sell their non-perishable crops on a glutted market when they could command the least for their labors. So they wanted to be paid fairly. And this is another interesting kind of point. All of this I'm going to point at the end of this populist lecture, but we'll talk about the divisions within the populist movement. In the peak of populism, and let's call it capital P populism, in 1892, the populist platform of the party was formed as a third-party alternative to the Republicans and Democrats, both of whom, as populists saw it, and they were generally right, did not represent their interests. The party's ideals, put forth on the Omaha platform, which you'll read in this week's Zinn reading, called for the abolition of national banks, a working day of 8 hours, and government control of all railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. In the 1892 presidential election, James B. Weaver carried 4 states, Colorado, Kansas, Idaho, and Nevada, and received electoral votes from Oregon and North Dakota as well. By 1896, the populists fused with the Democratic Party. Aligning with the Democrats was a giant thumb in the nose of the hopes of blacks. Although this greatly diluted the ideals of the Omaha platform, third parties have never had a realistic chance of winning in American politics. There was another reason why fusion wasn't so bad, and we'll get to that in a minute. Still, the populists run for the presidency and fail a second time. And then the party slowly drifts from presidential politics. So I think I want to portray the populists as modernizers and radical, rational actors. Their concrete political goals were not carried out in presidential politics, but through elected legislators at the state and national level. They wished to regulate capitalism, so they had a fairer shake at things, and they needed regulatory help to stay in the market dominated by massive corporations. They worked to establish inflationary monetary policy so that debtors, or farmers and even urban workers, could pay their debts off easily. They sought to establish government-backed commodity markets so that rural agrarians could better control the prices of their own crops. Rural agrarians, finding themselves isolated and powerless in segregated island communities, organized to integrate into the modernizing social economic order of the future. They organized for better education, modern farming science, and bureaucratic organization so they wouldn't be left behind. Key downfall of the populists, however, was racial prejudice. Lawrence Goodwin is a historian who too optimistically finds what he wants to find about the Populist Party, really applauding their legislative methods and organization. But at best, the populists split over the issues of racial inequality. When the North Carolina Democrats pushed to disenfranchise blacks via a poll tax and literacy test in the 1890s, populists were for the issue and a few were against it. As modernizers, they also supported segregation. If social beliefs in your era's science tells you that races must be separate, the populists weren't going to argue with that. And at worst, they also brought into the racist bile of the times. There was this guy called Tom Watson, who was a politician from Georgia, and he said, "I want no mixing of the races, for the Anglo-Saxon race is stronger." And this one of Watson's followers followed this up by letting blacks know that America was a white man's country, and these were populists. The movement's class appeal was that, much like the Knights of Labor, the organization might unite all workers and laborers into a political bloc. In the final analysis, unable to overcome America's history of racism, they were not as inclusive as they would have hoped. And thus, the populists represent a concerted effort to unite society in the hopes of expanding democracy and opportunity, but that negative, more paranoid style or racist style made it too difficult in the end. So thanks for letting me go through these with you. I know they're a little longer lectures, but I really appreciate it, you guys.